I am presenting work that is looking at the value or the potential value of a video game made in Ghana, and I'll just go through quickly. So I'm proposing a relatively under-researched approach to reorient student anxiety in parts of Africa around examinations through gaming in a way that teaches productive learning modes. The solution leverages a Ghanaian video game called Sweave to redefine failure as a learning opportunity within a cultural context. Accordingly, this is basically a preliminary reflection on this proposed response to a social problem that characterizes many educational spaces. As teachers, we all know what exams do to students. But the hope is that this can be eventually extrapolated on a widespread basis, using the game chosen as basis and inspiration to join other games that do something similar. And the problem here stems from student anxiety with failures and examinations. And of course, this, like I said, is widespread, but because of my experience in Ghana, I'll restrict myself to that context. And my point is that if we can embrace failure, especially in a country where success in examinations tends to be the determiner of progress and achievement in different ways, it can be done by returning to the past and privileging traditional modes of learning. And as such, my proposal is characterized by a decolonial turn, which I hope I'll have enough time to delve into at the end. Ultimately, I hope to show how decolonization serves as an important framework for this type of thinking. And the Ghanaian video game chosen for this is called Sweave. And the creator of the game says it's a hyper-casual, it's not moving, let me see. Okay, said it's a hyper-casual game that showcases African culture through unique patterns, weaves, and symbols. And on the App Store, it says that it explains what the game is, that it revolves around a ball that moves in a to-and-fro motion, similar to the weaving shuttle in a loom with Kente. I'll show a video of that to explain what I mean. And the goal of the game is to avoid obstacles that come in the form of African symbols like Edinkra and ancient Egyptian symbols. And it goes on to explain a bit more. So the game takes inspiration from Kente weaving. So I'll just play. This ancient way of making cloth, and it comes from two different ethnic groups in present-day Ghana. And what happens is the weaver moves a certain loom to the left and to the right and moves the cloth backward. And it starts from this and ends up something like this. And each symbol, or there are many symbols on them that tell different stories and have different messages. So there's folklore, to use the word, behind some of this. And my argument is that as the students, or as young people especially play these, they will learn a certain aspect of their culture, which can be used for progressive outcomes. So I'll just go back to this. So the game incorporates educational elements, specifically within moments of failure. And by conditioning a student's mind to welcome moments of learning while failing, the student can then start seeing other instances of failure as periods for learning. This orientation will eventually help the student to critique other times when they fail as important to their growth and evolution, both inside and outside the classroom, and stop limiting themselves to understanding failure as a blockage to their social and economic progress. This argument is made within a historical and contemporary context, which I will proceed to explain. So Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. And like most of Africa, it was the site of battles between European countries from the 16th to the 19th century. But after the Berlin Conference of 1844, when Otto von Bismarck called the different European powers to partition Africa, the British were given that area. So then in the early 19th century, the British undertook sweeping cultural reforms in the area. And one of these reforms was through education. So in 1928, the governor at that time, who was called Sir Gordon Gorgesburg, instituted a harmonization of the educational sector. And since then, between then and 2024, there have been about 10 reforms in the educational sector. And prominent among them were one in 1951, right before independence, by the then Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah, and then another in 1987, which was largely as a result of the structural adjustment program foisted on the country by the IMF. So I'll not go into the details, but in summary, Ghanaian students have largely prioritized exam success, and the colonial era reforms emphasized rote learning and exam performance, neglecting critical thinking. And this legacy has persisted, creating anxiety around exams and hindering a well-rounded education. So it's important to note that these reforms have constantly triggered a focus on examinations as the basis for assessing student performance. And these exams are typically sit-in written tests that take 2 to 3 hours with invigilators and exam scripts that they write on. And these scripts are eventually graded by teachers if they are at the local level, and external examiners if they operate at a national or international level. For example, we have West African exams, that's Nigeria, Gambia, and other West African countries engage in. And one fallout from this direction has been that the average student is more worried about their performance in an exam than they are in understanding and grasping learning outcomes. After all, they also worry that only the best students will obtain the few jobs that are available. And this anxiety is also worsened by international rankings that are informed more by examination performance than they are by other more productive assessment factors. In other words, the students are grappling with the fallout from this colonial era mode of action, which emphasized producing graduates who would further the British project on the one hand. Critical thinking and questioning authority were not integral to this formal education system. And on the other hand, the students also struggle with contemporary modes of hierarchical distributions that ignore context such as language, resource, and other factors. And coupled with the fear of not getting a job in a country where youth unemployment rates are sometimes double the national average, the obsession with exams is explained by these roots. But it's important to also note that Ghanaian education is conventionally divided into two. There's the informal and the formal. And the former is what existed before the arrival of the Europeans and revolves around apprenticeship and traditional modes of learning, such as storytelling and performance. And the latter is what is the focus of this presentation, because it's now it has been the mainstream way of learning for decades now. And the mentality of passing exams is prevalent from the primary level up until the tertiary level. And I have an anecdote to that effect. And when I was teaching one class in 2018, this was a literature class, a student just raised his hand in the middle of my talking and he said he had a problem. So I said, what was the problem? And he said he didn't understand the class. And as a teacher, you are a bit worried, like, why don't you understand the class? And then he says he finds it worrisome that when he and his colleagues answer questions, I sort of find sense in them and I sort of throw it back to the class so that we all understand it together. And then his colleagues, they start to nod. And then their point is that they would expect me to tell them what is in a text so that they can give it back to me in the exam. So that's quite worrying. But then, and I dug a bit deeper, and you find that this expectation of learning by rote is commonplace across the university. And there's a lot of research on this by scholars at the University of Cape Coast and the neighboring University of Education in Winneba. And for me, this hangover from the colonial period requires a decolonial response. And that's where games come in, but in a way different from what convention has presented. So scholarship into gaming in Africa usually rotates around 3 areas. And these are mainly understanding, using games for learning, understanding traditional connections between games and culture, and exploring the socio-economic barriers that hamper game development across the country. So for example, there's Anna Aching Asi from Kenya, who looks at the potential of video games to improve learning by learners and teachers, and she suggests that African schools have to utilize electronic devices for teaching and learning in order to allow them to harness the advantages for pedagogy in terms of innovation, creativity, and pushing more towards a multidisciplinary approach to learning. And she connects these to Bloom's taxonomy. Similarly, Tafofoko and Alan Amory investigate the use of South African digital games to help students in overcoming the long-held misconceptions in science while exploring their effectiveness in providing a platform that helps students assimilate a subject while improving accuracy and communication skills. And in response to the high failure rate among tertiary students in South Africa due to lack of ICT in the academic repertoire, they identify new educational methods through games, and their argument is that it successfully supports the learning and embracing of academic curricula. The second thread includes researchers like Jasper Goossens and me, actually. So Goossens looks at video games in which African narratives shape perspectives of African culture of people who engage with these games. And he draws reference from two categories of video games, those produced in Africa and those produced in the West generally. And I have also looked at how tradition has been sort of produced in Ghanaian video games. The third stream is actually the oldest, and there's been so much research on the problems in the gaming industry in Africa, so I'm not going to it generally. But what I propose is going to speak to this area of research, and is also going to look at the subject of failure in video games generally. And a lot of the research on failure looks at the difficulty of video games, including Jesper Juhl, for instance, and Anderson et al., who look at how difficult games and failure builds resistance in gamers, sort of make them mature by learning so many, or by making mistakes and by failing all the time. Others look at like how failure can be a desirable thing as well, and so on and so forth. But I want to make the argument that educators especially can use the game that I'm going to talk about as a means to speaking back to that educational or the examination mentality that I think is a big problem in Ghana. And it can challenge traditional notions of winning and utilize failure as a tool for cultural learning in various contexts. Of course, this is not a novel way of responding to the problem. Nevertheless, incorporating the learning of culture as is shown in the game is a helpful way of using history to improve identity while undercutting a wrong impression created by the educational system we work with. So Sweave is a video game created by Leti Arts, a Ghanaian company with Kenyan ownership, or Kenyan co-ownership. So this Pan-African collective is known for making games with a traditional flair. On their website, they say, "We are reviving Africa's culture and heritage, delving into ancient tales and sharing them with a modern, enchanting twist." So of course, they are implicitly acknowledging the evolving nature of tradition, as we talked about there. And they are saying that they will be incorporating contemporary interests into these delves into tradition. So this game, Sweave, is very similar. I have a short video of how it looks like when it's played. So this is it's taken from someone playing it on the mobile game. The lighting is not very good, so you don't see it very clearly, but you control a ball that goes through different obstacles. And yeah, so the various obstacles are symbols from different traditions. About what that's it. So it's a very especially in a place where people don't really So because I have not done the IRB or any of that stuff, so I'll just talk about very preliminary uses of the game, and I will sort of hypothesize on what I think will happen when I get a clearance and then do a full study. I'm thinking of doing focus group discussions with students who have played it and see what they're thinking as they move. But anyway, these are just sort of examples of when you hit. So for example, you hit Nyamiu Namu. So this is a proverb that comes from the Edinkra symbol. And so once you click on the learn more, then you learn what it means. And this is connected, not in the game, but a lot of these symbols are connected to folk tales. So the students can be encouraged to learn more about the folk tales, and then they learn more about their culture, as it were. Similar all the way through. This is another symbol called Epa. And once you hit it and you click on it, it tells you what it is. And they are handcuffs, traditional handcuffs, and they symbolize law and justice. So again, you learn about your culture in a certain way. And so these are Edinkra symbols, which are from the Akan, which is the largest group in Ghana. But the game also relies on ancient Egyptian culture, which is where the Akan believe they're from. And so this is an example from ancient Egypt. It's called the Te, and it's supposed to be a tree of life. And again, it gives the students sort of a moment to learn a bit more. And this is another example of the Akan and traditional symbols. As the students do this, they will be able to connect these with their own lived experiences and the experiences of people older than them, because we live in a country where a lot of young people are losing their traditions for what they find to be more accessible and more interesting things, which are foreign to the Ghanaian experience. So this gives them the opportunity to learn on that level. Another hypothesis is that by learning about their culture in this way, the students will appreciate their identity and background a bit more. And because by focusing on these ancient symbols, there is a connection between the modern and the tradition in a way that is productive to the students. But one of the limitations I see in this is the choice of cultures for this game. So, like has been said in some of the presentations earlier, we have different identities when it comes to Ghana, and yet the national identity is typically coalesced around the Akan, who are the largest group. So a game like this can give the wrong impression that Ghana has a monolithic cultural identity. So it would have been helpful if, for instance, the gaming or the gamers or the game creators rather had sort of accessed other ethnic identities in Ghana or outside of Ghana to have a more multifaceted experience. Of course, they are working with very restricted budgets, and they are constrained in other ways as well. But these are, I think, important critiques, even though, of course, having the ancient Egyptian symbols brings a different dimension to the whole profile. It would be helpful if they had others as well to have this larger pot from which the students could pick as they play the game. It would also be helpful if okay, so I'll just move forward a little bit to briefly touch on the decolonial aspects of the game. So of course, the term has been a buzzword for about the past 10 years in academia, but it's important to think about how formally colonized spaces move away from the negative implications of that vexed colonial history. One of the ways to do this is by reorienting ourselves from ways of being that connect very closely to Western modes of thought. I'll come back to that in a minute, but eventually they'll appropriate these strategies by critically examining historical and cultural foundations of how knowledge is produced and justified. And this will also involve re-examining assumptions, methods, and biases inherent in non-African ways of knowing, which have been foisted on them. So certain terms like rationalism, empiricism, objectivity, and universalism are usually understood as leading to the marginalization of other ways of knowing, such as indigenous knowledge systems, emotional-based knowledge, and spiritual knowledge. So by using games like this to speak to these ways of doing things, we can promote intellectual diversity and recognize the value of different knowledge traditions, address limitations of other forms of thinking and their role in colonialism and oppression, and develop more inclusive and context-sensitive ways of understanding the world. So I have just 3 minutes to go. So in conclusion, I'm not trying to be overly ambitious in my belief of in the potential of a small game to overhaul educational systems. And yet I think that they can serve as a starting point for us to rethink what it means to be educated. And one way of doing this is to privilege our histories and how we even tell our histories. After all, as a professor of mine likes to say, we do not want to become a back with which there is no front. Thank you.